Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation on what is COBie and how do you know. It's 3 after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we do, I have some announcements. First of all, some kind of housekeeping announcements about this presentation. First of all, there's no recording allowed. If you can't attend, I'll be hosting, or if someone that you know is unable to attend, I'll be hosting another one of these in 4 to 6 weeks. The next thing to tell you is that all the material is copyrighted Prairie Sky Consulting 2018. So in terms of presentation management, because we have quite a few people attending today, all attendees reduce potential background noise. And what I'd like to post questions in the chat window as you go, and I'll address them when we get to the end. Okay, so before we start, I'd like to have a little B is BIM level 2. 5 is LOD defines BIM quality. 6 is COBie requires BIM. 7 is embedded carbon analysis is within COBie scope. 8 is life cycle costing is within COBie scope. 9 is installed equipment lists are within COBie scope. And number 10 is IE. The initials IE in COBie are my personal initials. So this is a series of questions that I've been actually asking since about 2009, starting at the American Institute of Architects Technology and Practice Group, and it continues today on COBie Fact or Fiction. So this is, I would consider a pretest, and we'll return to this at the very end and see how you did. Okay, so now let's get on with the show. So today's presentation is entitled "What is COBie? How do you make it? How do you know for sure?" And some of you know me, and those of you that do, hi, and nice to meet the rest of you. My name's Bill East. Since retiring from the Corps of Engineers in 2014, I started Prairie Sky Consulting. I'm the director of the COBie Academy that you'll learn a little bit more about. And I'm also adjunct professor at the Dublin Institute of Technology. So when I started COBie, kind of my motivation was a phrase that I found in a report by the National Academy of Sciences. And the quote is here: much valuable data associated with the design, construction, and operation of a facility are lost during its lifespan. And I'm going to return to this this quote twice more, so look out for it again, because I'll focus on different parts. But this is kind of one of the motivations. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and certainly many of you know this guy is COBie Carl. And one of the fact or fiction items that you might take a note about is that his name is actually Lyle. And my colleague took this picture at a trip that we took to the installation near Tacoma, Washington, which is where Lyle works. Now, you know that Lyle is a pretty happy facility management guy, because you can see he's smiling there. But the reason he's smiling is because the stuff is off of the ground. It's on those pallets. So he knows when the boiler room gets wet, his information is still safe. So I'll mention Lyle maybe once or twice again during the presentation, and I'll refer to this set of boxes in the boiler room certainly more than once. And I think this has become kind of the catalytic photo to represent what COBie should be able to deal with and replace. But there's some other examples. So I was last year I was called to University Facility Management Office in Boston at a university whose three initial letters you would probably be familiar with. And inside their brand new renovated facility management office, the first thing I noticed was in the conference room they put me in, the fan coil unit had three different sets of barcodes on it. The nice one, which was the engraved big black and white one, fan coil FCU04, obviously that was put on by the contractor and he was paid to do it. You notice it kind of spans the front cover, so something's going to break is the first time it's used, but that's a little separate topic. The main point of this slide is that there's three separate barcodes, as you can see. So not only did the contractor have to do this, but somebody else had to do it two more times. And so there's at least three names for this thing floating around. And if you look at the original drawings, FCU04 might or might not even appear on the original drawing. So nobody really knows what this is or where it's from. Another slide that I'll mention about a motivation of COBie is this guy here. He's a grad student or was a grad student at the University of Illinois Department of Architecture. And just before I retired, this guy came to my office and he was taking his measurements. And I asked him what he was doing. And he said, well, we got hired to do an energy study of the building. And so I'm coming around measuring all the space volumes so we can do proper calculation. And I said, didn't you know that there was CAD files or, at this point, even BIM models of this building available? And he said, no. And I told him where, who to go call to find out. And he said, well, I was paid to go out and remeasure this. So that's what I'm going to do. And so here we are, a guy with a master's degree brain in architecture, whose primary tool is the telescoping tape measure. It's really pathetic waste of people's time to have to go and recapture this information over and over and over and again. And, just as an example of the kind of cost associated with it, in 1995, right, this is 1995, there was an estimate by the Federal Facility Council, again at the U.S. National Academies, that attempted to put a cost on the range of complexity and level of project that you would have just simply to produce the operations and maintenance manuals. So the standard number, $50 million project of average complexity, costs about $400,000. I showed this to a kind of policymaker at one point, and he said, well, $400,000 is not really worth the motivation for us to do anything about this, considering the size of the industry. And, it was staggering that was the comment, because this $400,000 is the tip of the iceberg, because this is just the cost to make the paper. Now, for one U.S. federal agency, they actually go and recollect the information again, because the information they get from the contractor, they don't feel they can rely on. So the first thing that happens when they move into a building is they go do exactly the same thing again. And this is on every building in their entire many hundreds of buildings portfolio. It's a tremendous waste of cost and tremendous waste of human brain to do the job the way that we currently do it. Of course, 3D building information modeling is supposed to change the world, and, to some extent it has, and specifically, 3D modeling now is used to produce the plan and elevation drawings that we use for contract documents. And in fact, it's extremely successful in doing so. Right on the design side, the numbers that I've heard is it reduced the cost of producing construction drawings by 60%. So what is the real value of BIM to an architect? It lets them fire draftsmen. Okay, that's the actual practical value. Now, in terms of the construction side, there's also tremendous value. Now, what's the tremendous value there? The tremendous value of 3D modeling is that it allows you to do three-dimensional light tabling, right? So back when I started, I would get a set of drawings and I would have to do what was called a constructability review. And what I would do is I would take the structural and the architectural and the ductwork layout, and I would put them all on a light table and line them up. and I would be able to circle the things where the duct was going through a column, or there was a pipe going through a door opening, and all of that kind of stuff. So what we really have done is have a fancier way to quality control the documents that we're already producing, right? So this is not really too far of a stretch. We're still basically using the same tools and techniques that everybody learned back when everyone was learning how to design on drawings. It's just they're three-dimensional now. So that's good. Now, besides the three-dimensional representation of the building, the geometry of the building, what's there? I really don't think that there's much there on most projects. In fact, almost every project looks just like this Western movie set. You know, here's the jail facade, and it looks beautiful. And look how great the texture is, right? And there's even a saddle there. The trouble is, when you look behind that model, there's actually nothing there. There's no substance. It's just a surface with some designation of texture. And my gosh, though, doesn't it look great, right? So because we have a suspension of disbelief, it's quite easy for people looking at a Western movie set to think the whole town is there, right? That's what they call suspension of disbelief, right? You know the whole town is not there. But we just go along with the fact, and everybody agrees, well, it's great. But in reality, the buildings really look like this on the inside. So what does that do for this great new technology for a guy like Lyle stuck in the basement with those boxes? What does he get instead? Well, what he gets, to the greatest extent possible, and the most, the best use, is shoebox formatted BIM. So this is the BIM repository of a U.S. government organization tasked to manage thousands of buildings across the world. I won't mention which one, but this is the cubicle of the BIM manager, and the as-built BIM goes in the shoebox in the upper left-hand corner. And so I call this shoebox formatted BIM, as opposed to three-ring binder format BIM or banker box format building information. And so what's the real value here? Well, actually, it's worse than having all the paper in the boiler rooms, because this guy retired, and now nobody knows where all of the BIM repository is for their facility, all of their facilities. So let's assume for a second that we were going to try and do something about this. Let's see how the structure of our industry almost prohibits progress in this area. So, and what I want you to think about before we talk about this specific slide, what I want you to think about is a guy who's putting in roofing shingles day in, day out, and he's using a claw hammer to do it, a roofing hammer to do it. Well, one day he finds out about a pneumatic hammer, and he says to his supervisor, hey, I can put down a lot more shingles in a day. Wouldn't it be great if you let me buy this? And they say, fine, and he does. And now this guy can do, maybe 30% more roofing per year, and he's happy because there's less hassle. But the company's also happy because they're making more money. Now, that's a pretty easy decision made for really one subcontractor crew, right? Or maybe across the whole subcontract. If you have a situation where you're trying to change how all of the parties in the project interact, like you do when you deal with COBie, then the situation is quite a bit more complicated, because even if you get all of these people to align this first time and you say, let's do a great COBie pilot, guess what? The next project is just as hard, because almost all of these people, except maybe for the owner or the construction manager or the contractor or the designer, everybody else would have changed, right? So the only way we can affect change across this whole stack and the structure of our industry is for everyone to adopt a common standard in order to exchange information in exactly the same way. Otherwise, every project is a COBie pilot, and eventually people are going to get bored and frustrated and just start ignoring, this new way to do things. Some owners, I'll just say that some owners have gone ahead and made their own proprietary format. The U.S. Navy, for example, is one organization that has a particular maintenance management system and hired a consultant to make a proprietary specification. So this is an example of every time somebody does a job for the U.S. Navy, they have to go through a learning curve to figure that out. And guess what that does for that owner? It increases the price for the owner. Again, adopting standards is the only way to organize this to keep every project from being a pilot. So if we go back to this statement, this motivational statement about data being lost over the project lifecycle, I want to focus now on what data we're actually talking about. And we'll come back to it one more time, but this time we're going to say, what is the data that we're actually talking about? Where is it located? And how might we extract it so that it's not lost? Well, if you have something that looks like this, either by contract or convention, that's delivered to you at the end of a project or that you create as a construction contractor, prime contractor primarily, with input from your subs, this equipment list is the valuable data. It's a list of every piece of equipment, its manufacturer, its location, who to call to get parts for, and what its model number is. Pretty clear. It's on every project, and we already do it every day on every project in every country. Somebody delivers an installed equipment list. The issue is every project you can do it any way you want, right? Or it changes from owner to owner. Here's another example. This is a boiler maintenance schedule. So if you have hot water, steam boiler, whatever it is, you have a maintenance schedule. And if you don't maintain that boiler, then it's going to have to be replaced, because once it breaks, you might not be able to fix it. Here's another kind of example of the information that we already captured, the valuable data already delivered on every project today. Consumable schedules. So here's one related to filters. You probably have other manufacturers indicating the list of recommended spare parts that should be purchased by the facility manager when they move in. What happens with that? It goes in a box, right? It either goes in the shoebox BIM because you just deliver a PDF copy of everything. It goes in the 3D binder formatted information and nobody ever looks at it, or it gets pulled out and is lost forever, or it goes in the basement. In fact, it took that guy Lyle, in order to replace a particular piece of equipment, it took him 2 days to dig through the information about a big grocery store that was built on one installation called the commissary. It took him 2 days to find the original requirements for the trash compactor. 2 days it took him to dig through that stuff. And that's just one of 1,000 of the things that he has to do every day on his project. He has full-time data entry clerks who do nothing but type pump 5 is in room 3 into the maintenance management system. So if we're going to take all of this stuff and squeeze it down into some data specification, the question is, what might that look like? And I'll just mention a little note for those of you that haven't seen my presentations before. I used that 5 1/4 inch floppy disk one time, and I had a grad student look over my shoulder, and he said, "What's that?" And I explained to him what it was, and I asked him if he had ever seen one, and of course he didn't. And then I said, "Well, what about the smaller version, right? The 3 1/4 inch one." Had he ever seen one of those? And he said no, but he knew what it was. And I asked him, well, if you never used it, how did you know? He said it was the save icon on the Microsoft software. So I hope that floppy disk down at the bottom translates for you. But the point is, we're taking all the data that we already collect on every project, and we're just trying to put it into a common format. And I would say to you that the format for most of that information is COBie, and it was published by me in August of 2007. And the name of it says exactly what it is. It's the Construction to Operations Building Information Exchange. So I'd like to pull that apart a little bit for you, because if you only come away with one thing from the presentation today, the name of the thing that we're talking about, COBie, is the thing itself, right? The definition is in the name. So this is the Construction to Operations. So it's construction handover data, right? It replaces the data that's delivered in the basement, right? In the boiler room or in the BIM box. It's the Construction to Operations, and building is the next word. So this is about buildings. It's not about roads. It's not about bridges, and it's not about pipes. It's not about dams or levees. It's about buildings. It's organized and designed to support buildings. And I'll have something else to say about that towards the end of the presentation. So it's the construction handover information about buildings. Now, what are the last two initials here? The information exchange. You see they're capitalized, but this is just because of the way the people made me publish the report. But they should be lowercase. And the reason that they're lowercase is because it's an information exchange. It's not that somebody manually creates COBie or should manually create COBie. In fact, you've already seen from the prior examples, the COBie data surrounds us on every project already. People are already doing it. All we're trying to do with COBie is to exchange it, right? And there has to be a common way to do that. And COBie, the Construction to Operations Building Information Exchange, is just one of many, right? You're going to want an energy analysis information exchange. You're going to want a geometric coordination information exchange. And in fact, as you'll find out later, COBie is an IFC model view definition. It is one of many IFC MVDs that eventually need to be developed, right? Every discipline has their own set of information. There will eventually have to be, if we're going to do information exchange using any kind of standard, a specification for that specific information exchange. There is no one ring to rule them all. There's no BIM to rule them all. There is no information exchange to rule them all. Everybody needs their own data. That's why our industry is organized in the stovepipes of different disciplines, because those disciplines need their data. So the data that's needed by Lyle, that model view definition, that schema for that data is called COBie, Construction to Operations Building Information Exchange. Now, let's also look at this cover, because the cover tells you exactly what happens. Designers provide the rooms and spaces, the list of systems, and the equipment, and where it's located in those rooms or spaces. That's all designers need to do. It's the contractors then that are required to fill out the make and model and serial number, because they're the people that know that information. There's no reason to have a designer sitting in a trailer transcribing data that the subcontractor already developed, and by the way, put together when they did the original approval on the submittals. So the designer has a role, the contractor has a role, and the facility manager has a role. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. So the name is in the thing. COBie tells you what it is. There's no hidden agenda here with COBie. So what is COBie? It's the information we already have in a format that anyone can use. So let's talk about how to create COBie. Well, anything that looks like a schedule is data, right? You can make a database of this fan schedule. And in fact, from the designer's point of view, COBie can simply be seen as the compilation of all of the scheduled data across all of the consultants, and including the architectural room schedules and window and door schedules. And let me show you just pretty simply how the scheduled data is translated into the COBie format. So all the schedules have a standard pattern. And the standard pattern is that the leftmost columns always tell you the name of the thing or the name of the type of the thing, if it's a fixture, and its location, if it's an individual component. So what happens is the left side of the information, the name of the thing and the room that it's in, that goes in COBie component. And every cell in the schedule becomes a row in COBie attributes. So it doesn't matter what schedule we're looking at. We could be looking at a door schedule or a window schedule or a fan coil unit schedule. They all can go into this one exactly same format. No matter the discipline, the format's the same. Pretty straightforward. And the software can do this. In fact, I'll be showing you some examples in a few minutes. Okay, so let's look at another example of the kinds of things that get delivered. You remember you saw that installed equipment list. Well, here's the original specification that required the delivery of that equipment list, and it said you have to give the manufacturer and the catalog and the serial number and where it's located and all that stuff, right? So how does that go into COBie? Well, really, all of that information is compiled in the same COBie component sheet, but over to the right. So the designers fill out the left-hand side, and the contractors fill out the right-hand side. So let me show you exactly where. So there's 3 different places that contractors or subcontractors should put the data. When they install the component, they can identify the serial number and the installation date. And let me ask you why we need to have guys with clipboards going around at the end of a project, busting ceiling tiles and breaking insulation to transcribe serial numbers. Or at least that's what they're supposed to do, right? What they actually do is they can't see the serial number because there's another piece of equipment right up next to it. So they use the serial number on the equipment next to it and just copy it over. You see this all the time, right? Items with duplicate serial numbers. And it's because we don't allow people to do the job because we're giving the wrong people the job. The installers know the serial number because they installed it. They also know the installation date, so let them capture it. The warranty start date is typically defined in COBie as the date you turn the power on to the piece of equipment. Who's going to know that? Well, probably the subcontractor is going to know that because he's going to be there to, check, right, and turn it on. And then we have later on, somebody puts tags on these things, brass tags or barcodes or whatever. So whoever does that should do that. So why should you have people going around with clipboards making up data when the people that actually create the data have it and should just be able to capture it? So if you're going to do COBie, don't wait till the end of the project. Let the people doing the job do the job. So how is COBie created? Well, really pretty simply, it's by using the software you already have on your desks for designers and exporting the scheduled data. And for contractors, it's unlocking the data that's already delivered in construction submittals. So let's talk about what COBie is. In specific, COBie is a standard, right? And it's a United States National Building Information Model Standard. It's an ANSI accreditable standard if you want to know the process. And it contains everything you need to know about COBie. So if you're going to take away the second thing from this presentation, is that if you don't have a copy of the COBie standard, you can't say that you know what you're talking about. The COBie standard is free for everyone to download. It's nationalbimstandard.org. You can Google it, U.S. National BIM Standard version 3. And COBie is under Chapter 4.2, and there's 2 annexes that go with it, so you want to get that. So let's talk about what's actually in the standard. The first thing to say is that everything that's in COBie is defined in the standard, so there's no ambiguity about what a particular data field means and its application, regardless of what format you're looking at this information in, and I'll mention something about that in a moment. So the first important takeaway here is that the definitions are in the standard. The second important thing about the standard is it tells you who delivers what COBie data to whom, when, and it provides standard sort of processes that explain how. Now, even beyond that, these processes are organized to demonstrate that delivering COBie data will reduce or eliminate a significant amount of waste that occurs on every project. And we actually have a COBie calculator that will calculate the waste that you can get rid of as a result of having COBie data and using it throughout the project. Another thing to tell you is that COBie tells you exactly what should be delivered and what should not be delivered. Okay? And it tells you how to test it. And this is really important because there's a lot of folks that are implementing COBie that are creating huge sets of jargon and huge work for consultants that is completely unnecessary. The standard of COBie tells you what to deliver. Okay? So first of all, it tells you it's about buildings. And second of all, it says deliver anything that's not on this list. So COBie could apply to any kind of building, right? It could apply to a power plant. It could apply to a school. It could apply to a hospital. It could apply to a residential home. So we're not going to tell you what should be in the project because the people engaged in the project already know. It's on the drawings, right? It's in the data. It's part of the models. So the standard can't say what is the information you should deliver because that's your standard of care as a designer or by contract or convention as a contractor. That's the information you deliver. What COBie will tell you is, here's the stuff that Lyle doesn't need to know about. Don't include any information about this. And so there's a list that says, here's the stuff never to include in COBie. And what you never include in COBie is anything you build on the site. So you don't put in ductwork, you don't put in piping, you don't put in walls and slabs, you don't put in ceilings. Okay? This is what you don't put in COBie because that stuff does not have a maintenance requirement. It does not have a make, model, and serial number. It doesn't have a fan belt. It doesn't require oil. Now, are there other things that facility managers might need to know about? Sure. Absolutely. Right? They might want to know the whole history of everything in the project if there's a problem. Right? But that's not part of the COBie scope. The COBie scope is to help Lyle manage that building so that he can say pump 5 is in room 3. It requires these components to fix. Here's how long it's going to take me to fix it. And here's the product data so I know how to do it. That's what COBie is about. It's really quite simple. People that want to make it more than this are not doing COBie. They're doing something else. And according to the standard, if you're doing something other than the standard, you actually can't call it COBie anymore. So another thing COBie says is it tells you in the standard itself exactly how to check the data that comes in. And there's 2 checks. The first check is, does the information is the information in the file that you're giving me consistent, right? Because in a generic situation, a standard can't say what's correct to deliver in a hospital versus in a residential home, right? But it can say, if you tell me that pump 5 is in room 3, there better be a room 3. If you tell me there's 4 floors, there better be spaces on those floors. So there are very specific business rules that test the quality and consistency of the information. And then for you, when you're getting this information, you check it against the drawings because that's the contract document, right? You can actually check, okay, there's pump 5 in room 3, but maybe there's pump 6, right? Did you put that in there? Well, COBie can't tell you. You'll have to know that because you know about the project, right? So there's 2 tests that have to be done, but the test on the quality of the consistency of the data can automatically be done. And the rules for testing that are in the standard itself, right? Just like any other standard. The quality control requirements are part of the document. So if you're not using these quality control requirements, then guess what? You're not delivering COBie files. Okay, so what else? COBie is a life cycle information exchange. It's specified the entire life cycle delivery of that information is in the schema. That doesn't mean everybody provides all the data, as I alluded to in the graphic, right? In the 2007 publication, designers do a certain part, contractors do another part. The COBie specification, the standard, it tells you which fields are to be filled out by designers and which fields are to be filled out by contractors. If you're requiring designers to fill out contractor data, you're not doing COBie. Okay, so I mentioned COBie as a model view definition. If you Google COBie model view definition, you're actually going to be able to see the subset of the IFC model that is the schema, right? The data specification for COBie. Now, everybody talks about something called an IFC file. There is actually no such thing as an IFC file because there's multiple model view definitions. If you're going to talk about exchanging information using IFC, you have to start with knowing that any exchange requires a specification of a model view definition. So when you talk about an IFC file today, what you're actually talking about is a coordination model view file delivered in step physical file format. And unless you're explicit about exactly what you're getting, then people think that you're seeing the outside of that western town and it's a beautiful day, and because there's one set of drawings and one BIM file, everybody understands what's going on. But the fact is that inside that file and behind the facade, there's nothing there. So you have to specify the specific model view in order to ensure that the testing that you can test to make sure that you're getting the data that you require. So here's the technical specification for COBie for those of you that want to look at the details of ISO 16739, the COBie schema basis for this. So if you're going to pull out the standard, for most people don't care about those details, right? Because that's a software guy's business. So if you're going to pull down the standard, there's a lot of software guy stuff in here. What you need to look at, as I mentioned before, are the terms and definitions, the conformance testing procedures, and the mapping rules, because they actually tell you you can deliver COBie in a bunch of different formats. There's actually 4 different formats that COBie data can be delivered in, and they're all consistent. In fact, you can take data from one format to another and have it be exactly the same data, right? It's just presented in a different way. So one of those is step physical file format, which is ISO 10303 part 21. That's the format that a coordination view files are always exchanged in, okay? Another format is the spreadsheet format. And the annex COBie mapping rules tells you how to go back and forth between the step file format and the spreadsheet format. So let's talk about the resources available about COBie and some of the things you may be interested in finding out, how to get more information after you've gotten a hold of the standard. So the first place is most of the original first 10 years of the work, first 7 or 8 years of the work was published under the Whole Building Design Guide. And if you Google COBie and Whole Building Design Guide or wbdg.org, you're going to have access to all of the public records because this was done with U.S. taxpayer money. COBie's not copyrightable. Anybody can use it for any purpose. The only stipulation is if you change it, you can't call it COBie anymore. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff here for you to take a look at if you're interested in the history of the COBie project. There's example buildings. These are the original example buildings. We started off with this little duplex building in the upper right-hand corner, duplex apartment, 2 two-story apartments back to back. It's a great, if you're interested in the step physical file format and what that looks like and how to actually understand how to do that and work with that format, you can go to these websites, pull down the duplex apartment IFC coordination view file, and I would encourage you to take a look. I think it's a great, what programmers would call a hello world example. Now, we quickly got away from that example and went to the project on the right, but the project on the right, which was project with plan and specifications, and the test was, can we have data that matches the drawings? That was the simple test, right? Does your data match the drawings if you're a designer? Because it has to, right? contract. So what you're delivering as doesn't, why bother with that data? So for many years, clinic, and of course it's a pretty big building, so to have a complete find it under my company's website and under testing. And again, anybody can use this for free, but you can't make changes to it and then redistribute it, right? You have to get it from the original source. Okay, so this test model was used by real architects and engineers to develop how-to books. And the size of the books is really sort of representative of the actual size of the books. It's not there's no priority, right? The one on the left is 8.5 by 11, and the one on the right is 6 by 9 inches in size. So we use this new test model, and for the ArchiCAD book, which was first, some of you probably know the COBinator, Rob Jackson in the UK. He actually did the blow-by-blow about how to do COBie correctly out of ArchiCAD. And ArchiCAD doesn't produce actually COBie files. What it does is it produces IFC coordination views that have been extended to include the COBie data from designers. And then you have to use a third-party software to extract that COBie data if you want the COBie data only. For example, if you want to give the COBie spreadsheet to a contractor, you can't use ArchiCAD directly. Now, on the other hand, Autodesk deals with primarily the spreadsheet export. There is a way to do the step physical file format as a extended coordination view file, but it's quite a bit more difficult and requires some manipulation of parameters and things like this. So while some people do that, most people are really just satisfied with getting the spreadsheet export. So what we did with the one on the left-hand side is we actually got every discipline individual 100% compliant COBie files, and you can see those on the testing site. You can download them. You can reproduce the test project. You can get the book and figure out how to do it for yourself, and I can guarantee that this will save you a tremendous amount of time. Now, if you're an owner, how should you be thinking about specifying COBie? Well, the way that I think about specifying any deliverable in a contract, and having worked as a government contract project manager in the construction side and R&D side, for 35 years, what I can tell you is every good requirement has three parts in the US. It has a code, and that's the COBie standard. It has a commentary that tells you how to apply the code under different circumstances, right? The commentary in US practice for COBie was published in 2012, and I think it was updated maybe one more time. It's called the COBie Guide. So, and the COBie Guide says, well, it's great that we have the standard, but we also want to check it against a specific project. So the rule is the data has to match the drawings. It's as simple as that. So that's really what the COBie Guide says. And then there's a contract, right? So you can have a standard and you can say how it should be applied, but unless it's in your specific contract, it's unenforceable in the US. Now, many people have this kind of thing that's like a requirement. I was working with a Canadian government agency recently, and they said, well, we're just going to tell somebody that it's a requirement. Well, how is anybody going to bid that? I mean, because they don't know how it's going to be enforced. They don't know how many times you're going to have it delivered. They don't know the quality control process. They don't know that you're going to hold a retainage on them. All of these questions have to be answered, right? I mean, we're talking about contracts here, right? We're not talking about an aspirational view of people exchanging data. This is business, so there has to be contracts. And so you have to have a COBie section in your contract. And there's an example here that gives some important highlights about what should be in there. Now, I'd probably revise it based on what I know now a little bit, but I think it's got most of the major pieces in there. So, code, commentary, and contract. These are important documents to have, whether you're requiring the delivery of concrete or you're requiring the delivery of testable information in a data format that's called COBie. So if you're going to test this data, there's the software to use that you can use is free. This is the same software that's been used to test most of that, all of the files from the ArchiCAD and Revit, and many of the files that were developed through the last couple of tests at the Army, all used free testing tools. There's a book that has the documentation for the tools, but if you want to download the tools, they're called the COBie plugin for BIM server. If you're dealing with step physical file format, and they're called the COBie QC reporter if you're dealing with the spreadsheet version. Now, the BIM server one will do the spreadsheet version too, but generally I recommend not doing that. Now, these are open source pieces of software, which means anybody can make changes and make a branch, copy the code over, make a change, and post it back. So far, we haven't had a lot of engagement in that, but we have had many, many people download these and use these successfully in projects. Because they're free open source software, we spend all our time working on the actual code to do the checking of the files. We didn't spend a lot of time making a fancy user interface. So if you're unfamiliar with Java programming and open source software, just go buy the book, and it has step-by-step instructions to install this stuff on Apple or Mac, Apple or IBM, Microsoft computers. The full set of instructions are there. And I think you'll find this very helpful. The standard specification actually requires that every COBie deliverable be accompanied by one of these reports. Software is free, so go use it and check your files. Other people claim to have file checking software. It's never been verified by us, by my programmer and I, that it actually does exactly what's in the standard. Who knows what it does? It's never been used to officially, formally test products against the standard. Okay, so my standard set of resources that I recommend people take a look at. You can find these under my company name and resources. So there's a link down at the bottom. It includes a bunch of my blog posts you might find interesting, like what I would do if I were BIM king of the day, king for a day. I think you find those kind of funny. There's a LinkedIn group many of you are familiar with. There's almost 5,000 members at this point. And so I'd encourage you to post questions here. I'm very strict about this. Some of you might already know. No advertising is allowed here unless it's directly related to COBie, and really unless it's related to moving things forward. It doesn't get posted here. There's no marketing allowed unless it's directly related to the standard itself. There's a bunch of videos. Probably the two most popular, COBie for Designers and COBie for IFC. I just checked today, and both of them have over 6,000 views, and altogether 45,000 views of these videos. So if you Google my name and COBie, and you probably find my channel. There's probably 30 or 40 little videos there. Luckily for you, they're all under 10 minutes. When I was working at the research lab, many of them were over 50 minutes, and so they're much better than they used to be if you knew them back in the day. So there's also a set of classes that I host. I grade the exams. They're that I run, I should say. They're hosted at the University of Florida, with the Rinker School of Construction Management as my partner, and you can find these under COBie Academy. And there's one for COBie as designed, one for COBie as built, and one for COBie quality control. And these cover the various aspects of the standard related to each of these, what the designer is responsible for, what the contractor is responsible for, and how to check it. The motivation for doing this is I started having University of Florida sponsored week-long on-site seminars. And what we found was many people preferred to do it online. They couldn't afford to take a week away, travel to Florida. Especially a lot of international folks had a hard time getting there. It was very expensive for them. So for about a 40% reduction in the cost of that week-long on-site seminar, you can take these 3 classes and get what we would do in person. And actually, it's better because I grade the assignments. We didn't have assignments in the in-person course. So you and I are going to have an actual conversation as you figure out how to do COBie. So I would encourage anybody that's trying to apply the standard to at least have one COBie expert on the project or in your company or as part of your facility management organization. Take this class so that they'll be your in-house expert. Because who's the expert today? It's the guy that you call that knows one thing more than you, right? Whether it's right or wrong, it sounds like he knows one thing more than you, so he's the expert. And then we end up having this kind of tin can telephone game, or what I found out in Ireland is called the Chinese whispers, right? Where you start, and by the time you get to the end of the circle, you find out the story has changed. So this is what happens unless you get the actual facts. So download the standard, take the class if you need help figuring it out, and then you'll be the expert. You'll know. So what to do about this mess of technology implementation is another important question. And in terms of what's coming up, I put together something called a COBie scorecard, but this is actually going to end up being one of these University of Florida classes. What the COBie scorecard does is allows you to communicate with people in your company, your business partners, whether prime or subcontractors or designers or consultants, how to communicate to them what your requirements are, how to make sure the people that are working with you, like if you are an owner, the facility manager, or your IT department, how to engage them in this conversation, how to make a standard process so that by the time you've done a COBie pilot, and maybe 2 or 3 of them, the next time you won't have to do it, right? Or if you retire or go to a different job, that COBie process will be burned into your organization. It will be part of the specifications. It will be part of the standard operating procedures in your office. So getting the processes squared away. And really, the least important of all of this business is the technology, because the technology, as we all know, will change over time. The files, the CAD files and the BIM files that were from 5 years ago, you might not even be able to read, right? which is another reason why you want the data in an open standard. It might be locked in a proprietary format. So technology is the least important part. Using open standards is sort of critical to make sure the owner gets the value of their data, right? It's their building, it's their data. So we'll have a class on the COBie scorecard. Now, another preview of coming attractions that was just, in fact, this is the first time I've ever mentioned it in a public meeting. The United States Institute for Building Documentation, which has a certification for qualifications for those doing laser scanning in the US, and I'm sure it could be used internationally. They're now moving to identify COBie as part of the building documentation. So they're documenting this with the scan, the as-built geometric conditions, and with COBie, they're documenting the as-built facility management and building information data. So this will be coming up, and if you go to USIBD, contact them. You can get on a mailing list. We'll have some, since this just got approved, we'll have some ways to engage, and I'll be mentioning this on the LinkedIn group. And hopefully we'll have some of you interested in the COBie certification. Particularly if you're an owner, what I would say is the value here of having a required COBie certification is because you have an assurance of at least one person in that organization is going to know something about the actual COBie standard and not just what he heard his neighbor say. Right? So if you're an owner, I'd ask you to think about this and maybe contact me about it. So let's talk about the other part is, how do you know when you have COBie? Well, part of it is, you know, because you can test it. But also, how do you know if it's not COBie? That's an important kind of a counter question to have. And to answer that question, I'd like to show you this picture of a gymnasium. So in the US, we would call this a high school. And this is a multi-purpose room. So you can see the bleachers that the people on the right-hand side of the picture are sitting in. These are movable bleachers, so they can be pushed in. These basketball hoops up in the ceiling, they can be winched down, right? So that you could have a whole class and be running like 8 different basketball half-court basketball games in here instead of one full basketball game like what you're seeing here. Now at the other end of this room, there's a stage and a curtains and a theater. So this is where you have the graduation. This is where you have the high school musical. And so this is a great multi-purpose room, right? And it's designed to do lots of different things. And as long as you're within the range of the things that this gymnasium or multi-purpose room was designed to do, it works great, right? And you can call it the gym, you could call it the multi-purpose room. But as soon as you start using it for something other than what it was designed for, you begin to have problems, right? Because it doesn't have the heating and cooling capacity, perhaps. It might not have the floor load. It might not have the restroom facilities, right, that might be needed. So let me give you an example of a use of this engineered artifact, the gymnasium, that's out of scope for the gymnasium. Right, so here's the gymnasium used as an emergency shelter. And the question that I would like to pose to you is, if you have something that's an engineered, a designed artifact, and you use it for a purpose other than for which it was designed, what happens? Well, so the first thing you can say is, well, you can use it in this way, right? You could. It's possible, right? Then the question is, the people that are in here and the people that run this building, how is that going to go for them? And it's pretty clear that if it's like 2 or 3 nights and your house has been flooded, right? And after a week you go back home and you start fixing it up, well, that's an acceptable use, right? It's a temporary use, and everybody acknowledges that the reason that you're doing this is because you don't have any other option, right? Because otherwise you would drown, right? So you go to the shelter. If you're saying that we're going to do like this for like long term, what do you think the people in this building are going to say? Well, no, they're going to say we need to use it for our purpose. And the people that are living here, they're going to say, well, this is crap. We can't live in this building. Well, guess what? You were never supposed to be living in this building. So the reason that I'm saying this in the context of when is COBie not COBie is just like the multi-purpose room. When you use COBie for something other than construction to operations, building information exchange, you're using it for a purpose other than which it was designed, which means you're going to be uncomfortable. And if you do it for long enough, people are going to get angry about it and say, well, it's no good, when in fact it was never designed to do what you're trying to do with it. So use COBie for the purpose for which it was designed. So let me conclude the formal presentations. Well, I'll have a little bit more after this, but to conclude the formal presentation by bringing you back to this original motivating picture, right? Much valuable data associated with design and construction of a facility are lost during its lifespan. And now let me focus on the citation. For those of you that don't know, this was actually done in 1983. And I was recently talking to the former executive director of the Building Smart Alliance, and his boss actually went to this meeting, and he remembers him going to this meeting. The meeting was in 1983, and guess what? In 1983, the technology was available to do COBie in the way that many people are doing it today, by spreadsheet. This technology was available, and the problem could have been fixed in 1983. So 40 years later, right, we're here talking about something that could have been fixed and people knew was a problem 40 years ago. And so my question to you after taking this presentation and understanding that COBie data is already on every project and we already do it, it's just a matter of formatting the information, is why are we going to not do it, right? Because if we don't do it, you and I are not going to be around in 40 years when our sons and daughters are having exactly the same conversation and looking back at us like I'm looking back at these guys saying, well, why didn't they fix it? So let me encourage you to get started on your COBie journey so that we can avoid being the people that our children talk about 40 years from now. So I asked at the beginning to please submit some chat. So let me have you put in some Q&A in the chat box. And I'm looking here. And the first question from Bobby. Hi, Bobby. Hi, Ireland. And Bobby's question is, does all the COBie data need to come through the 3D model? And my question is, where does it come from today? Right? Who owns that information? So the 3D model is primarily a geometric activity, right? It's to help designers make cheaper construction drawings. That's the actual, economic benefit. For builders, it's there to deal with the electronic light table, like the collisions, right, between the pipes and the columns and the ducts and so forth. That's the purpose of that thing, right? So if you start using it for some other purpose, is it going to work? Well, you could jam it in there, but not likely. So where is the actual information? It's on paper, because that's where we put it today. So what COBie is saying is, let's get the data out of the model and let's attach the information that we can glean from that's currently on paper and put it together. So yes, the geometric information can be linked, but primarily most of the information that's going to come in, like the maintenance list and the spare parts and this kind of stuff for the boiler and the chiller, that's never going to be in the building information model. At most, all that you're going to get in the building information model is the manufacturer and serial number and installation date. But then why? You got to have somebody type it in when it's already being delivered in a standard format. So thanks for your comment. The specific answer to does all COBie data need to come through the 3D model is no, because it doesn't today. It doesn't. So why make it do that, right? That's somebody's aspirational vision. You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. While you're thinking about adding a question, let me bring you back to the original test. I'm going to ask you to pull out that sheet of paper that you had at the beginning, and now we're going to do the post-test. Okay, so right next to the answer that you had before for number 1 is COBie a spreadsheet. Now you can identify if you want to change your answer, because the actual answer is COBie is not a spreadsheet, right? That's the format that COBie data can be delivered in. Number 2 is IFC replaces COBie. Hopefully you know that what a ridiculous statement that is. It completely, you don't understand what you're talking about at all if you say IFC is going to replace COBie, because COBie is, as identified in number 3, COBie is a model view definition. COBie is an IFC ISO 16739 model view definition. That's its purpose, right, is to define that. COBie is BIM level 2. Well, no, not really. BIM level 2 is a political artifact created by the UK government that requires COBie, right? So BIM level 2 is all kinds of other things beyond COBie. In fact, in the UK, it's called COBie-UK because they actually can't call it COBie because they don't do COBie. They do COBie for all, right? They do COBie for infrastructure. They put walls in COBie. They put pipes in COBie. COBie is not meant for any of that. COBie is pump 5 in room 3. That's what COBie is. It's Lyle in the basement with those boxes. LOD defines BIM quality. Well, I would say no, right? COBie requires BIM. No, COBie does not require BIM. In fact, you could do COBie using CAD if you were a designer. All you have to do is get the schedule data. COBie requires at minimum PDF if you have to be nasty about it. And you can screen scrape the PDF, because this is what I'm forced to do on many of my projects because the data simply doesn't exist. So the 7 and 8 are also false because, as you know, COBie is what? The construction to operations building information exchange. Construction handover is COBie scope. Anything else is out of scope for COBie. Number 9 is absolutely true. Number 10, on the other hand, is absolutely false. My name is not Ian, so these are not my initials. In fact, somebody suggested at one meeting that I must have a middle name of Ian. So that's why I threw that one in. So if you want to see the actual fact or fiction about this, you can see it on one of my blog posts. So here we have some more comments. Let me look at these. Are you involved with Autodesk Navisworks COBie plugin? Your thoughts? So the answer from Aaron on this is, at the time that we published the Autodesk Revit book, Autodesk was not recommending the use of Navisworks COBie plugin. What I would do is I would contact Autodesk and ask them if that's still the case. Now, obviously, they're not going to say that in public, because a lot of people use Navisworks, but this is according to, the people from Autodesk that I worked with to make that book. So from Stefan, would I consider COBie to be a U.S. biased standard, or is it rather a universal and applicable in European countries too? Well, I guess you can say that the UK is no longer a European country if you believe Brexit. Obviously, COBie is mandated for all public projects in the UK. And I would just ask you on this particular question, what is the situation in your boiler rooms and in your facility management offices? Do you have a situation where you have boxes and boxes full of stuff that nobody uses, or 3-ring binders full of information that get pulled apart the first time they're used, and the binders are basically useless things that look nice on the wall in the facility management office? If these are the situation, if that's the situation that you have, which in my opinion exists in every industrialized country in the world, then COBie is an IFC model view definition that is applicable anywhere to solve that problem, right? Because the problem is everybody has a pump 5 in room 3, and it has some maintenance requirements, and there's a strainer upstream from that if you don't clean, the gunk in the strainer is going to cause the whole building to get shut down. So that strainer has to be cleaned once a year. That's a maintenance schedule that goes in COBie. I think for many engaged in the Building Smart International community, they think that reinventing the wheel is a great idea. I don't understand it. I don't see it. I think it's a political and a not invented here syndrome. If you have a guy like Lyle, then COBie will fix your problem. COBie can be customized for regional application in one of 3 ways, and these are specified directly in the standard. The standard tells you that you can customize COBie. The first way you customize it is you pick your local classification or regional classification or client-specific classification. So if you use Uniclass instead of Omniclass, if you have a Scandinavian format that you want to use, do that. Not a problem. The second thing is you can take the list of elements that are currently excluded in COBie and you can expand that list. So you can't put walls in COBie and still call it COBie, but you can't say, well, I, as an owner, I'm not interested in managing doors and windows, so I really don't care about that. What I want is the chillers and the boilers, because that's number one. If I don't manage those, the building's not going to be usable. So that's what I'm interested in. So you can remove items or add items to the exclusion list. The last thing you can do is you can require specific properties be delivered. So if in your existing construction contract it tells you that you're supposed to be delivering the electrical equipment, voltage and amperage and phase on every piece of installed equipment, then by all means. But what I would say about properties is people are going hog wild thinking, well, let's get all the product manufacturers to deliver open standard models. And I can tell you I spent 7 different iterations on doing that. COBie was basically one iteration and then multiple versions, right? It's version 2.4 is what's in the current standard. I tried 7 complete restarts of this product definition project called SPIE, and you can find out all the glorious failures that took place. The thing about the product data coming in and getting the product properties directly from manufacturers is the structure of the industry is too distributed for anybody to crack this nut, in my opinion. You'd have to have a command economy or somebody like the size of Walmart or Tesco demanding everybody do it the same way, or else it's not going to be done. That's just in my view. Now, the practical side of that says, okay, well, what data can you collect? And the answer is the data that's already part of the standard of care in design and construction. That's the data you can get delivered. So for designers, what does that mean? That means everything that's a scheduled property, everything that appears on a drawing schedule can be delivered. And that's going to change over different projects, right? And it should, right? Because there's different standards of care for different projects. So whatever's on the stamp, the engineer says this is the data needed to build the building. That's the data that can be delivered in the COBie schedules or on the drawing schedules and then transformed into the COBie structure. And then on the other side, you say what's currently required by convention or by contract during design, and then how can I collect those properties and be explicit about it, right? Because what you want to say to people is, this is data you're already collecting. We're just asking you to collect it in a common way so that everybody can get access to it. Okay, so I hope that's saying, is using software such as Maximo and Revit with bidirectional data transfer promote good use of COBie and BIM? Vince, on this topic, what I would have to say is, first I want to make a comment that the exchange between Maximo and Revit actually takes place using COBie. This is another value of this thing, right? Because Maximo versions change over time and Revit versions change over time. And do they want to write an API that's always having to be tweaked every time anybody has a different version? So you need like 15 different APIs, right? Because not everybody's in line with all current versions. So you have to maintain and support all possible combinations of all of these things. Well, having a standard helps the software companies just as much as it helps owners, designers, and contractors by having this standard API. So is the exchange between Revit and Maximo a good practice? Well, what I would say is those companies find benefit in using an open standard, COBie, to do that. And so I think that answers the question. In the general role of the integration of 3D modeling and putting that in the hands of facility managers, I think that's kind of an open question. I recently saw an example of field techs using tablets that had 3D presentations, and these guys found it very helpful. And I think the interface, a lot of time, years and years were spent working on the interface so that it could be easy. And so people wouldn't get lost in the interstitial spaces of 3D models. And, there would be gravity and all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of time was spent doing that. And I think it looks like it was pretty well accepted. But I would say that the future is very distributed, right? Most facility management offices can't afford to give guys tablets, because they know they're going to have to give guys tablets a couple of times a year because they're going to get busted in the field or greased up or, rained on or whatever. And then if you provide hardened ones, then it becomes expensive and people have to keep track of it, and then it becomes an inventory control issue. So until these devices are ubiquitous as, people's back pocket cell phones, I think it's going to be very hard to roll it out on a kind of a very widespread level. I think that there's some very straightforward, simple technologies that can provide a middle ground for this. So this is from E. Hughes. If you have a client who has specifically asked for building elements excluded from COBie, like internal partitions, how would you manage that? Excluded from COBie and delivered separately, or added to the COBie workbook? Well, so the first thing that I would do is I would ask, what is the purpose for the delivery of that information? Right? They're asking for it maybe because they actually have a reason, right? And so let's say that you're the UK Ministry of Justice and that your job is to manage prisons, right? That's one of your jobs as Justice Ministry. And in the management of those prisons, one of the things you want to keep track of is if the walls have been messed up inside the cells. And so the question of how do you represent that in data is not necessarily tied to the fact that those are wall objects, right? I mean, those individual cells, they're not going to change. Room 5, cell number 5 is going to remain cell number 5 as long as that building is built, right? As long as that building is occupied. So really what they want to know is they want to know the information about that room, that space, and you can simply change the way the information is organized so that you have the finishes or the condition of the finish of the wall as an attribute of the north, south, east, west, walls, just like you have in a finished schedule, right? So this is one way to get around this requirement. Now, the real problem with doing these walls this way is if they want the walls for each space, nobody ever designs or builds or models these things in this way, right? The designer is going to build one wall per floor because maybe that's how it looks and how it's easiest. The contractor is going to do it a completely different way. Maybe the designer is going to do one wall that's going to span 5 floors, right? The builder is going to do one wall for each level, right? Because that's how he has to build it. And if you're going to take that whole wall and have to actually make little wall segments for each piece, it's really insane when you find out what the actual question is what's the condition of the walls that are being managed. So this is what I would recommend, is that you use attributes to collect information about this instead of using the, trying to do something different. You try and actually answer the question that the client needs answered. Now, there are things that don't fit well in COBie, right? That you might have. Let me just give you an example. So you might have jobs that are tied to the facility, the overall facility or the system. Currently, COBie jobs are only tied to type. You might have information you want to deliver about consumable parts that are delivered as part of the building. So you might want to have extra floor wax, right? That's delivered, that's put in the janitor's closet. You might want people to know where that is, and that's available, and that consumable part has to be managed. There are ways to make to do the modification and to represent that information in the COBie format so that it can all be delivered in the same way. And if you want to have that conversation, we can talk about it on LinkedIn. I think it's too detailed to talk about it this time. Signage is one of these issues where COBie has it one way, but maybe signage is more complicated. If you're doing a hospital, obviously signage is extremely complicated. If you have one ballroom that has 4 separate subrooms, there's another kind of conversation to be had about signage. So you can already find some of this information on the LinkedIn group about how to consistently do that. So I hope that answers the question and maybe a little bit more. So from Ricky, is the goal to have manufacturers to have support data in the web? It seems like some of the table information would be hyperlinked to manufacturer sites. So yes, if you go to the type reference field, COBie.type.reference, and again, I'll use the spreadsheet presentation of the information because it's easier for most people to talk about rather than give you the IFC object names. But obviously there's a direct correlation between the two based on the standard NXA. Okay, so if you go to the model reference, it says during construction, that should be the URL for the underlying product. Now, the reason why you don't want the product data only to be delivered in URL format is the manufacturer's website will change, but you have to live with that building for 50 or 100 years. So you can't have, there is also a contractual issue, right? You have to have the data that was approved on the project to be part of COBie, not the data that's on the manufacturer's changed website. Back to the product data specification project, the SPIE project. I said many projects have IE, SP, specifiers, properties, information exchanges. Just one other example. There's many other examples that you can find. Back to that project, the original idea was, and in fact, in 2009, I believe, maybe 2010, we actually had a demonstration where a company you might have heard of, General Electric, and their competitors Leviton and Lutron, they had websites that said, okay, here's the product data sheet for this light fixture, and right next to it is a link for the XML data that's represented in the product specification in that spreadsheet. So they had a COBie file and proper data, right? And they had the cut sheet right there, right on the website. And even having General Electric was insufficient to move the industry towards this point, because that person changed jobs and then the whole project went away. So it was never instituted in those standard operating procedures we're talking about so much. Okay, so the next one is, can you add new columns to the COBie type and component sheets, or should all project-specific attributes appear in the COBie sheet? So the first thing to tell you about this is the only testing that's done is testing for production and consumption of COBie data using commercial products against the standard itself. I did mention that there were multiple ways. There were 3 ways I mentioned before to modify COBie that is acceptable. There is one other, and that is by mutual agreement, project teams can add columns to the right of the columns that come on the standard spreadsheet. Now, what that would mean in the IFC world is you would add extra property sets that would be specifically defined for that project, okay? And, getting the data in there is a whole different story, but it's possible to do that. By convention in the spreadsheet, we usually color code those rows a light blue. So if you see projects with color-coded light blue columns, it's probably because those were added on. Now, let me give you a cautionary tale about doing this. The first bit of the cautionary tale is every column you add that's not part of the standard adds cost to your project because it's not part of the standard, right? It's some owner's specific requirement. The second thing to say is experiential caution. And you can see this situation yourself, is that in COBie type worksheet, it was required to have a manufacturer property set that actually doesn't exist in IFC. We had, I couldn't find it the last time I went to look for it. Although that was the intention, was to have standard product data like size and type and finish as a property set in IFC and have that delivered by the manufacturers. And when we first started doing COBie, we said, well, every type is going to have, generally these kind of columns. It's going to have, size and type and, dimensions, bounding box dimensions and weight and all of this kind of stuff that you might want to know. And so we're going to put that in COBie type because by the time this COBie thing takes off, manufacturers will get this and they'll start delivering the data. So we had an aspirational vision of what could actually be accomplished. Now, if you look at every COBie file you look at today, the majority of the columns on the right-hand side from starting with expected life all the way over, all of those are null n/a values, either $ in IFC or n/a in the spreadsheet, because nobody ever takes the time to fill those out. And if they did, the data is more appropriately put in attribute, because you don't get that information across all of the instances of those things. So there's a little bit for you to think about. It is possible. You have to do it on a case-by-case basis, which means the software has to, be tested again for the things that you add. And it adds costs and, probably is not going to work out in the long term. Although sometimes it's easier for people to visualize what it's about. Okay. Okay, so I think maybe we answered Ricky's question already. To Kong's question, what would I say about a client that's asking for structural engineering elements such as concrete and steel frames to be included in COBie? What I would tell them is that those elements, and you can go to the specific place in the COBie standard and look at the excluded element list. It includes IFC beams and columns and slabs. You can say, look, these are excluded from COBie. If you're going to do this, you can't call it COBie anymore. You have to call it something else. And in fact, there is no structural engineering IFC model view definition to deliver that information. Right now, if the purpose of having that information is actually to know something about the capacity of the spaces, then just like with managing walls, maybe there's a reason that they're asking for this information beyond just the purpose that you think. In other words, they're asking for something that they think is an answer to the question, but their question is the wrong question, right? Or their problem is not being articulated in a proper way. So I would dig a little bit further and ask why. And then, if you need the separate model view definition, then give it to them separately. But I would say if you're going to do COBie, it's pump 5 in room 3 and the manufacturer and the model number and the O&M instructions. That's the purpose of it. So if you keep it clean, then people are going to be able to execute it. And if you mess it up, it's going to be a mess, and actually you can't call it COBie anymore. So someone asks, is the presentation being recorded? No, the presentation, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not recorded. I'm prohibited from recording COBie training outside of the COBie Academy. So there are, however, a bunch of YouTube videos that I mentioned, and lots of other people have information available. Almost everything I presented has web links here, and you can find it by Googling those specific things. So Ricky said thanks. So Ricky, you're welcome. Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, so there being no other questions, thank you so much.